Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, June 10th, 2025, and our friend Scott Ritter is back with us. Welcome back, Scott.
Thanks for having me.
Scott, let's get started with what the NATO Secretary General said about the conflict in Ukraine. Here is what he said.
Agree with Kyiv that to end this war, it's going to require additional long-range strikes into Russia to take out its industrial capacity.
Well, to end this war, we need Putin to come to the negotiating table and not with this historian who is now popping up in Istanbul twice and again telling us about the history of Russia and Ukraine from whatever, the 12th century, I don't know what it was. And constantly restating what they stated already in 2022. You need a Russia which is serious, wants to negotiate and end the war. And to get there, it all, I think, starts, of course, with keeping Ukraine strong in the fight.
He didn't mention keep Ukraine strong. Would that mean that they're going to strike deeper into Russian soil? Your take on the way that he's described?
It's curious, the terminology used, to keep Ukraine strong and in the fight. That's a British term. That's the British strategy. Keep Ukraine in the fight. Literally, that's the words used by the British military establishment, intelligence establishment. And so Britain is the one driving this. And what does in the fight mean? It means asymmetrical approach to the conflict because Ukraine cannot win on the battlefield. And so what you will see is, and again, the question is from a British questioner, implying that person has been fed leading questions by the establishment to sustain this notion of Ukraine in the fight. This is a propaganda war as much as it is a real war. The sustaining the notion that Ukraine is capable of staying in the fight, but it's not just the implied threat of long-range strikes, which is one of the British strategies. Again, the British for this perfidious Albion. The British are just very bad players right now. They're one of the most destabilizing factors in the world today. But what they are seeking to do is they think they can apply psychological warfare on the Russians. So you carry out limited direct action operations of a asymmetrical covert nature to make the Russian public feel at threat. And then the implication is that these can be expanded, and this is what you do with the long-range drone strike capability. And now the idea is that you're going to increase Ukrainian capabilities, and the implied threat is to follow up on what Germany has said they want to do, is provide Ukraine with long-range strike capability to bring all of Russian industry at risk. And this will bring Putin to the negotiating table. That's their plan. But all it results in is more dead Ukrainians, more destroyed Ukrainian infrastructure, and the Russians increasing the scope and scale of this special military operation. It won't accomplish anything. Rutte knows this. I mean, he knows this because he has articulated this. The Russian defense industry and field artillery shells is outproducing the totality of NATO 4-1. And you have similar disparities when it comes to tank production, infantry fighting vehicle production, etc. Russia is outperforming on the defense industry side. They're outperforming on the societal sustainment side. Russia is able to generate 30 to 40,000, recruits a month into this. The Ukrainians struggle to get 25,000 a quarter. It's an unsustainable war. So I think you're going to see the preparation of European audience, the population, et cetera, and indirectly the preparation of the Russian audience for increased strategic strikes inside Russia to strike, defense industries that have been hidden, on the Ural mountain lines or even beyond. To create the impression that Russia is not a fortress, that any part of Russia can be struck, and that to continue this conflict is hopeless. But what people don't understand, and it was rapidly being proven, is that Russia's never, taken the gloves off. Russia's always been just playing patsy with the Ukrainians. Let me prove positive. As a former military targeteer, I can tell you right now that on day one, the rail line linking Poland with Kiev would have been eliminated, and there would never be a single train making that transit. No train would enter Ukraine. Trains are pouring in, trucks are pouring in, bridges are up, electricity's on, people can go to restaurants. All that would have been terminated. Ukraine's not a nation at war, but now it's beginning to feel like it because Russia has taken the gloves off, and they start to hit targets. Ukraine, Russia has said that we will avoid targets that have the potential of inflicting civilian casualties. Ukraine takes advantage of that by transitioning much of the defense industry into heavily urbanized areas in facilities that are co-located with civilian, housing. Russia hasn't been striking these. Russia now is striking these with a very precise nature, and they're taking them out. Look at Kiev this morning, a city on flames. Not a single Russian drone or missile hit a civilian target. The casualties, to the extent they exist, in the form of people who get hit by Ukrainian air defense systems, or if a drone gets shot down, where it lands is not able to be controlled. But and I think you're going to see an escalation of this nature, and that should be the signal, because Russia has to send a signal to the West that what happened in terms of both the terrorist attacks on the two trains or the drone attacks against the airfield can never happen again. And you do that by creating not just the theory, but the reality of disproportional response. That if you do this, the punishment you shall receive will be so overwhelming that you'll never want to do that again. And the Russians are not just targeting the Ukrainians, but they're starting to pick out the British-centric targets inside Ukraine. You saw, for instance, they struck a building that was formerly associated with the issuance of British passports and visas that had been repurposed for other things. It doesn't function anymore. It's gone. And I think you're going to see that the British infrastructure that has been overlaid in Ukraine to implement this keep Ukraine in the fight concept, that infrastructure is going to be targeted. You're going to see more British casualties come out of this. But this isn't even it. I think, in the United States, on 4th of July, we got it coming up in a month. We have these great fireworks displays. And you've seen American fireworks displays? It's general everywhere. You start off with ooh, ooh, and then you get sort of lull thing where you go through and then a little lull, and then and then you finish with the grand finale. It's just everything comes out, wipes it out. We're about a third of the way through the ooh phase, where Russia's just coming and going ooh, and then they come in, pop, ooh. We're not even close to the grand finale. But when the grand finale comes, you'll know, because it'll be so devastating, so horrifically destructive, that it will reset the deterrence benchmark to say, you never want that to happen again. Drone strikes against Russian strategic targets, because this is the outcome. And the next time it'll be even worse. And that's where Russia must reset the deterrence benchmark, because if they don't, then Ukraine will just continue to do these strategic deep strikes, as Rutte has alluded to. What Russia has to do is make sure that Rutte doesn't even think about supporting that kind of thing down the road.
Does the British government believe if they go after some sort of escalations with Russia, that would bring the United States in, that would force the United States to come in and maybe support NATO countries?
The only hope the British have, and you've heard this with Starmer, you've heard this with Macron and other European leaders, is the American backstop. That's the term they use. We're willing to take the lead if we have the American backstop, which means that America's there looming. America won't be on the ground, but they're there. So if the Russians act in a way that threatens the survivability or sustainability of the European operation, America can step in and save Europe. The United States has made it clear they're not going to even do that. One of the last hopes of Europe was that American air power would at least be offered up to protect a European force. And I think that that's been taken off the table too. We won't have anything. So there is no American backstop. But the British are believing that the lack of American backstop is based upon current geopolitical realities that are defined by the level of Russian violence on Ukraine. What the British are hoping to trigger is a hugely disproportional Russian response. And what I mean by that is I actually think the British are hoping that Russia responds with a tactical nuclear weapon against a Ukrainian target. That's the level they're trying. That's the only reason why they would strike strategic bombers, to trigger Russia's nuclear doctrine. This was a deliberate act, knowing that they were triggering Russia's nuclear doctrine. I believe that they were hoping that the Russians would act in accordance to their doctrine and use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. And in doing so, create an environment that causes the United States to rethink their entire approach. And now there not only will be an American backstop, but the Americans will help take the lead in responding to what happened, because that's the only path towards salvation that exists. And when I say salvation, I don't mean salvation to Ukraine. If your policy is designed to trigger a Russian nuclear attack against Ukraine, you can't be sitting here telling me that you care about Ukraine. What you're trying to do is preserve the position of the European Union and NATO, who are in a very difficult situation right now. And they can only survive and only grow if they have America fully engaged. And this is where the Trump policy of disengagement from Europe is detrimental to, to the future of NATO, of Europe. So Ukraine right now is a proxy conflict that the United Kingdom is seeking to turn into a nuclear conflict so that the United States will re-engage decisively.
I don't know if you watched the interview of Medinsky on RT or Russia Today. He pointed out very crucial informations for us to understand what would be the Russian position in the talks that are happening, right? That are happening between Russia and Ukraine. Here is what he said, one part of the argument on his part.
Я вам скажу одну вещь, Рик.
I will say one thing, Rick, which I have never said before publicly. If Ukraine wanted, if Ukraine were ready, if it made its own decisions, we would have been able to sign on February 28th, 2022. During that first meeting, and the conditions would have been much softer than what we're offering today.
Yeah. Go ahead, your take on the way that Russia sees it and the way that Donald Trump sees the conflict. It seems that these are two totally different pictures in the mind of Russians and in the mind of Donald Trump.
Well, first of all, think about what Medinsky said here. February 28th. When did Russia go into Ukraine? When did the special military operation begin? February 24th, right? 22nd. So 6 days. That's right, 6 days. The first meeting in Gomel. Now, there's a little bit of background here. Why did they have a finished document ready? Because what's largely not told in the buildup to this conflict, we've talked about the Minsk Accords, and we speak how Minsk was shredded by October. What came after that was Russia directly engaging the Normandy format, that is Germany and France together, saying, forget Ukraine, they're irresponsible. You guys, what are you willing to do? And they weren't willing to do it. Then Russia went to their December 17th draft treaties, where they put one to NATO, one to the United States. That was ignored. And then people say that then led to the Russian action. But what's missing from there is the Russian engagement with the Ukrainians, the direct engagement with Ukrainians saying, okay, it's about really going to go bad for you guys. We will come in. It will be ugly. We'd like to avoid that. And Zelensky, the smirking chimp that he is. I mean, I apologize to chimps. I don't mean to insult them that way. But Zelensky has talked about this, and so has his advisors, and they smirk. Well, we led the Russians on. What many people don't realize is right up until the SMO began, we were letting the Russians believe there could be peace. There could be peace, and we let them on. And then we yanked the thing out. Well, the Russians had negotiated in good faith. So that when the Russians initiated this thing, what they were trying to tell the Ukrainians is, you don't want war. You don't want war. This is what war means. We're ready to have peace. And they could have signed something on February 28th that would have been far different than even what they were talking about in Istanbul. Because Istanbul has to take into account, realities. The Russians are very reality driven. So as the situation develops, but what on February 28th, they could have ended this whole conflict instantly, but they didn't, because Ukraine had to go back to its masters. This was always been a war that's been driven by foreign power. And the major foreign power driving it is the United States at that time. This war wouldn't have happened without the United States. Donald Trump calls it Joe Biden's war, but what he forgets to tell the American people is that Joe Biden inherited a policy that was built by Trump during his first 4 years, that this is Trump's war, very much Trump's war. One of the reasons why they couldn't accept the February 28th conflict termination proposal that Medinsky talks about is that the United States has a strategic objective attached to luring Russia into a conflict in Ukraine. That is the strategic defeat of Russia, necessary to trigger economic sanctions, to choke off the Russian economy, create societal unrest that leads to political collapse in the end of the Putin regime. That was the American objective under Trump. Donnie Boy won't be honest about that, but it was inherited by Biden, expanded by Biden, and now it's the same policy under Trump today. Has anybody seen the executive order signed by Donald Trump ending that policy, saying it's no longer the policy of the United States to seek the strategic defeat of Russia? No. Has anybody heard mention in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, or Washington Post about the president signing a finding ending the CIA secret war against Russia, a secret war that, by the way, goes back decades, not just limited to the Ukraine conflict, but the CIA is in a state of war against Russia. Has the president ended that? Nope. So Donald Trump lives in this fantasy world where he's trying to convince people that he's hands off. He's hands on. He's 100% hands on. This is Donald Trump's war. That's the reality of this thing. The Russians are here to solve problems. Donald Trump's here to write fiction. The Russians are based in reality. Donald Trump lives in a fantasy world, self-delusional, with no solution except one that makes Donald Trump look good. The Russians aren't in the business of making Donald Trump look good or look bad. The Russians are in the business of solving this problem, which is why, Ritter can make fun of the historian all he wants, but the thing about having Medinsky on board is you're not going to pull the wool over his eyes. He knows the history of the negotiations. He knows everything. And he's not going to allow somebody like Donald Trump to try and paint the situation as something that it's not. To say the sky is green when all of us can look up and see that it's blue.
Maybe I'm pessimist about what's going on in Ukraine, but what I do see by these negotiations, these talks that are happening, and Russia is not going to get anything by these negotiations. Look at the Ukrainian government. They're not even taking the dead bodies of the Ukrainian forces back. And how in the world can we believe that Ukraine can reach an agreement with Russia if with the push, with the way that Donald Trump is putting pressure on the process? And as time goes by, don't you think that they're gonna increase these sort of terrorist acts on the Russian soil that could ignite something big, something we haven't seen for more than 3 years of the conflict in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine? That would hugely put Donald Trump in a position that it would be as dangerous as we can imagine. Is that a concern on the part of Donald Trump, or he's not even thinking about it?
It's hard to say what's a concern of Donald Trump, because that requires to get into the mind of Donald Trump, and that may be a mission impossible. But when you say Russia's getting everything at once from this negotiation, everything at once, do you think Russia wants to negotiate? First of all, read the totality of the Russian proposition that's been put forward on the table there. You do know that there can't be a peace signed with Ukraine until Zelensky's gone and there's been new elections. You know that, right? So why are we talking about a negotiated settlement with the Zelensky government? Denazification means denazification, and Zelensky's a Nazi. He's a terrorist. The Russians have said he's gone. And Medinsky is even hardened that position. Putin has come out and called Zelensky a terrorist, and we can't negotiate with these terrorists. So we have to understand that what is the purpose of continuing this process? Remember the earlier conversation we had about Starmer and the British and the need for an American backstop. The purpose of continuing these negotiations is to keep that American backstop from manifesting itself, to create a potential outlet. And Russia is doing this masterfully. But no, this war is not going to be ended by negotiations, unless you want to liken the negotiations to General Krebs meeting with Chuikov at the end of the Battle of Berlin. You know, where Krebs came in and thought that he could negotiate terms of surrender. The Russians went, there ain't no terms of surrender. Sign the damn document and we get to dictate whatever happens to you. And that's what happened. This war will end when Ukraine is given similar terms. Sign the document. You don't get to speak. And if you're lucky, we'll let you live. That's how this war ends. This war ends violently. This war ends with more violence. Because that's the only way it can end. Because, as Medinsky said, Ukraine's not in charge. Ukraine's not calling the shots. The British are. As long as the British are calling the shots and America's willing to let the British call the shots, this thing ends violently. Because the British don't care about the Ukrainians. They're willing to sacrifice all of Ukraine. Again, I come back to the very premise. When the British are willing to create a scenario that is designed to provoke a Russian nuclear response, how can you care about the Ukrainians? The English are the most dangerous force on the planet today because they're the ones that are pushing a nuclear conflict to the detriment of the Ukrainian people. So there won't be a negotiated settlement. Donald Trump lives in a fantasy world. There could be if he was willing to make certain phone calls, but Donald Trump has shown that he's not willing to do that. So Donald Trump will be strung along by his own inadequate policies, and Russia allowing these inadequate policies to have life breathed into them. You know, notice despite everything that negative came out of the second round, there's talk about a third round. Doors open. That appeases Trump, gives the possibility of peace. He hasn't walked away from the process yet. But what's happening on the ground? Ukraine's being slaughtered. The Russian military is advancing. They're destroying more. They now have, strikes against Ukraine that are destroying economic infrastructure, destroying industrial capacity. It's the end of Ukraine. This thing doesn't end until Ukraine is finished.
But the escalations and the terrorist activities that they're planning for in Ukraine, and Ukraine is just executing, just performing what they've been said to do in Russia and toward Russia. My question was that if Donald Trump is concerned about the United Kingdom, you've mentioned the role of the United Kingdom and how seriously they're involved in Ukraine today. It's not just about Zelensky, Scott. You see, Zelensky is the Ukrainian ambassador to the United Kingdom, is part of the plan. He was part of it. That's why he's in the United Kingdom. I don't see anybody replacing Zelensky would change anything in Ukraine until Donald Trump do something important in terms of the way that the West is supporting the government in Kiev, is supporting the British government in their activities toward Russia and Ukraine.
But Trump's never going to do that. If you're expecting action from Trump, you're waiting in vain. What will happen is the political and societal collapse of Ukraine. Yes, you have these people who are carrying out state-sponsored terrorism. It's a problem. Russians lost 12 people. Maybe more will die from injuries, hundreds wounded. But, when the Ukrainian Nazis went into Kursk, they took over one of the border villages and slaughtered 90 people. They've killed hundreds of Russians. we're talking about a nation that took 27 million casualties during the Second World War. If you think that Russia is going to be intimidated because terrorist acts kill a handful of people here, there, and everywhere, it's not. You think that Putin is that easily manipulated? I mean, my God, then what kind of leader is he? If all I have to do is carry out a handful of terrorist attacks and I get Putin to respond, then I'm inside his OODA loop. I'm inside his decision-making cycle. I own him. I direct him the direction I want to go. That's what the British want to have happen. The Russians are staying steady. They know their focus. They know their mission. They're going to accomplish it. And no amount of terrorism is going to strike out. What it is going to do is change the Russian response. How many times has Russia tried to kill Zelensky in the last 3 years? How many times have they tried to take out Budana? Yeah. They've let all these people live these amazing lives. And now they're going to die. That's what's going to happen. And you'd be surprised that when you start paying for your patriotism with your life, how quickly people stop being patriots. When these Ukrainian fanatics start dying in droves. I'll give you an example. One of the sexiest jobs in Ukraine for the longest period of time has been drone operator. Why? Because you're not on the front line, but you get to sit there and put on your little goggles and guide a drone and kill Russians. And you get to make videos of it and post them on YouTube. And you're like, ooh, I'm from this unit. You can give it a sexy name, you know, and we're the Chasov Yard Terriers. And here we are, another video put up by the Chasov Yard Terriers. And then look, Russian soldiers looking up in panic and blowing up, and look at going and blowing up, blowing. Look how good we are. Drone operators. And all the young kids want to grow up to be a drone operator. And even the pretty sexy TikTok girls want to be drone operators. And they all become drone operators until the Russians figure out how to kill all the drone operators. Now, the most dangerous job in the Ukrainian military is drone operator. You turn on a drone, you die. Azov battalions or regiments, brigades scream a third assault brigade. We can't hold the front line anymore. Why? Because we used to flood it with drones and stop the Russians. But now, as soon as our drones come up, the Russians kill all our drone operators, and we have to fall back. It's no longer the sexy job. Watch how quickly Ukrainian drone efficiency drops when it's safer to be on the front line as an infantryman than it is to be a drone operator. That's the reality of what's going on. All these people that say we want to commit terrorism and we're going to do this, it's sexy because the British allow it and it's asymmetrical warfare and you can call it anything you want. But when you start dying, it's no longer sexy. You'd be surprised how few fanatics there truly are. Look at the end of the Second World War. SS, all these Nazis out there. Hitler said, go up to the Alps. Berchtesgaden, the werewolves, the redoubt, dig in, make the Americans dig you out in this long way. It didn't happen. Because once the war was over, people didn't want to die anymore. People wanted to live. This war is over. And Ukrainians are going to start waking up to the fact that they don't want to die anymore. They want to live. So this whole terrorist campaign is going to fizzle out. It's not sustainable because the Russians will hunt you down and the Russians will kill you. They have long memories and they have long arms. Just ask Trotsky. So I'm not trying to downplay what the Ukrainians are doing, what the British are doing. I'm just saying it's my assessment that the Russians are far more resilient and realistic and pragmatic, and they're not panic driven. They're not susceptible to panic. And you're going to see these attacks. They will absorb these attacks. They will respond accordingly on a timeline driven by their own objectives. But if you want to dance the dance of death with the Russians, they will kill you. Just ask the Ukrainian drone operators. All those beautiful TikTok girls, they're dead. All those, hot little, high school tech nerds and run around going, I'm a tech nerd. You're dead. They're all dying. It's the shortest lifespan out there. There's a Brit out there. I don't want to give his name away not because I'm trying to save his life. I don't care about his life. I just don't want to give him credit. But he's out there, he has this little, X page where, hi, I don't provide drones to the Ukrainians. I don't provide training to the Ukrainians. He's now saying, I got to get out of here. Why? Because he's going to die. It's not safe. The Russians have broken the code. They are in whatever exists that defines the drone operations. They know how it works. They have constant overwatch. They know they're looking for patterns of behavior. They know how the communications work. They know how everything works. And the second you go out and deploy your footprint down there and you start launching drones, you're hit. And the Russians have so many Iskander missiles right now, because it used to be you'd have a Ukrainian, a Russian drone up there and see it, and then and the other Russian drone comes in. They have time to package and move out, shoot it down, air defense umbrellas and all that. Now it's an Iskander. The Russians have so many Iskander missiles right now, and they've prioritized properly that when you have one of these drone units come out and they're 2 SUVs and they start deploying drones, because remember, to have a drone swarm, you need a lot of drones. So they got to lay them all out there and start launching them. Boom, 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 swarming in. Bam, a scanner, and they're all dead. That's what's happening. So I think the Russians are in control of the situation, and they're not going to let it get out of control, no matter what the British are trying to do with their keep Ukraine in the fight stupidity.
Scott, how long Russia does need the buffer zone if we assume that finally they're going to win on the battlefield decisively? Do you think that that would bring some sort of sanity to the West, to the mind of these Europeans who believe that the NATO Secretary General said that Europe benefits from prolonging the war in Ukraine? But how is that the case, and how is that going to influence the Russian mindset on the buffer zone?
Well, the buffer zone is a political military concept driven by the notion that there can be a negotiated peace. Because what the buffer zone does is separate a Ukrainian military from the Russian military and from the Russian homeland. You create a buffer zone so that the longest range weapon system in the possession of the Ukrainian military, if launched from Ukrainian controlled territory, can't reach Russian territory. That's what the buffer zone is. But again, it's predicated on there being A, a Ukrainian military, and B, a Ukrainian governing authority that continues to operate in opposition to Russia. Otherwise, you wouldn't need a buffer zone. There ain't going to be a Ukrainian military, and there ain't going to be a Ukrainian governing authority. The buffer zone right now is just a political ploy. There won't be a buffer zone. There will be a defeated, occupied Ukraine. That's it. Because there won't be a negotiated settlement. Ukrainian government has precluded that. So why are we talking buffer zones? What we're talking about is that Russia will be occupying significant swaths of Ukraine, and then a decision will be made whether or not Russia will absorb these swaths into Russia proper. That's the phase of the conflict we're at right now. Ukraine had a chance, as Medinsky said. They could have signed on February 28th. They could have signed in March 30th. They could have signed in April. The Russians kept the possibility of signature all the way open until June. Remember, Russians were withdrawing troops from Kharkov in June. The First Guards tank army that was deployed in Kharkov, 50% had been pulled back to Belgorod when the Ukrainians launched their offensive in the fall of 2022. Russia was doing everything possible to create an environment conducive to a negotiated settlement. It's Ukraine that opted out every time. That will never happen again. I just think we're at the stage right now when you have the president of Russia call the president of Ukraine a terrorist, and how can we negotiate with them? And if you read carefully the Russian negotiating position, it's over. There won't be a negotiated settlement. And the only way you have a buffer zone is through a negotiated settlement.
To understand it, the NATO Secretary General, how did Europe benefit from the war in Ukraine? Economically, militarily, do they see it as the United States is more connected with Europe today in terms of their military? I don't see that. I don't know if the United States is more committed to what's going on in Europe. How did it benefit Europe, the war in Ukraine?
Well, first of all, we have to be careful of taking what Mark Rutte says at face value. He's a salesman right now, snake oil salesman. You remember Baghdad Bob? You know, the Iraqi minister of information, and sitting there up till the very last moment, literally the last day. Everything's fine. We've driven the There are no U.S. tanks in Baghdad. Behind them, there go the M1 Abrams rolling behind them. In many ways, Mark Rutte is Baghdad Bob, trying to spin a disaster. What situation has he found himself in? Let's talk about NATO. NATO has, since the end of the Cold War, bankrupted itself militarily and politically. It stopped being a defensive alliance and it's become something that has been used for offensive military action in Europe, a war of aggression against Serbia, in Libya, in Afghanistan, occupation and nation building. So far away from the North Atlantic, it's not even funny. They were involved in Iraq. They've tried to move into the Middle East. They have programs to move into the Pacific. I mean, NATO is this expansive militaristic entity that expanded politically, but not militarily. All the governments that are in NATO stopped funding their military, with the exception of the United States. The rest of them underfunded. And I'm here to tell you right now, you can have an army of several 100,000, but unless you pay for training, then you just have a bunch of fat, beer drinking, schnitzel eating, useless soldiers. Unless they're out there training all the time. When I was in 29 Palms, California, with the 5th Battalion, 11th Marines back in the Cold War, our operational training and tempo, I was in the field over 260 days a year. This is in peacetime. I was in the field training, live fire artillery training, 260 days a year. Now I was in the battalion staff. That doesn't mean that all of our batteries are out there all the time, but it means some of our batteries are out there all the time. We were out there pulling lanyards all the time. And every time you pull a lanyard, that's a round of ammunition going down range. My battalion used more ammunition in 1 year training cycle than the entire Marine Corps uses in 1 year now. We don't train the way we used to. It's expensive, very expensive. And there's a lot of other demands that are put in there, but all we focused on was operations. And as a result, we were pretty damn good at what we did. But it doesn't happen overnight. You have to train nonstop training. And it doesn't happen just to train me up. Every time I get new Marines rotating in, every time, we rotate Marines out, we got to train those Marines up. So even though we have the battalion at this level right now, as we rotate people out, down we go. So we got to keep the training up. Sustainment. Expensive as hell. I was talking to somebody the other day. They said that, my father was stationed in Germany during the Cold War. I said, what unit was with? And they said he was with, I think it was 7th Cav on the Fulda Gap border. And I was like, those guys literally were on a combat footing. Even though they were shooting, they were the forward element designed to put a screen in case the Soviets came over the border. And so they didn't get to sleep. These guys were out there moving every day, tactical positions in a tactical environment, working tactically, training, thinking combat oriented, a whole different mindset. These were lean, mean, killing machines. These were people who were ready to fight, prepared to fight. And we proved it during the Gulf War. I just want to remind people, the Iraqi army was a combat-hardened army that just won a war against the Iranians. Its Republican Guard was an elite force that had been carrying out massive scale operations. These aren't garrisons troops. These are guys who were used to being in the field fighting, maneuvering as divisions, as corps. They knew how to do all this. The world's 4th largest army, perhaps the most combat hardened army in the world at that time. And we wiped them off the map. It wasn't sanctions that beat them. They had all the new equipment. We wiped them off the map because we were just that much better. And we were better because we trained. But it's expensive. And then the Cold War ended and we stopped paying for training. We just stopped. We didn't put them out in the field like that. We looked for simulators and we looked for, storyboarding it, and we looked for alternative uses of our military, and we just brought everything down, just reduced everything. The peace dividend. And so NATO's military today can't fight, literally can't fight. I'm just being dead up serious with you. NATO can't fight a war. They have air power that can go out and drop bombs on things. But look what they did. They went up against Serbia with limited air defense, and they lost some aircraft. And the Serbian air defenses impacted how NATO employed its aircraft. But the Serbians didn't have the most advanced air defense, integrated air defense ever. They went up against Libya with no air defense. Yay. They went to Afghanistan. Yay. The integrated air defense of the Taliban doesn't exist. They supported operations in Iraq. Again, no air defense. So the NATO air power doesn't know how to fight, literally doesn't know how to fight. Their ground forces are worse. They can't get out of the barracks. They can't get a brigade generated. When they get to the field, they don't know how to sustain it realistically under combat conditions. And their troops just aren't conditioned for this. If you're not conditioned for it, if you're not conditioned for war, when you actually go to war, I'm just here to tell you, the first, when I joined the battalion, I remember the first exercise when I was a week-long exercise. I didn't get any sleep for a week. And I'm like, wait a minute, the human body needs sleep. And they're going, no, it doesn't. And you learn how to sleep in a Jeep, bouncing over. But even then, you got to keep your radio headset on. Boom, boom, boom. So you go, whiskey alpha, yeah, whiskey alpha. And you got to be alert. You got to know. And then it comes out and sleep again. Whoop, up you're going. 7 days. You don't sleep. If you don't train for that, if the first time you're doing it is when the balloon goes up and suddenly, you go through your first 24-hour cycle and half your soldiers are sleeping, you're dead. You're dead because the enemy, they're ready. They know how to fight. They aren't exhausted. They're coming in. They're going to kill you all. That's NATO. NATO can't fight. Doesn't know how to fight. Hasn't fought a major war. They can't do anything larger than a brigade-size exercise with any. Everything else becomes a command post exercise with notional brigades. But, try and get 2 brigades to do a passage of lines. What is a passage of lines? I don't know. In wartime, if you've engaged and you fought the enemy to standstill, but now you've taken losses and your mission has to be assumed by another brigade, you do a passage of lines. They pass through your lines to sustain the fight. If you don't train for it, you can't do it. And what will happen is you pass through and you get this jumble of mass, and then artillery comes down and kills you all. NATO can't fight. That's the reality of it. And the cost of getting NATO up to where it can fight is prohibitively expensive. So NATO is broken militarily. It's broken. Rutte knows it. Rutte knows it. Politically, NATO is a disaster politically. Let's just give you one little example. NATO is supposed to be a unified military alliance, right? Everybody on the same sheet of music? Well, we know they're not, but let's show you how ridiculous this is. Let's take Croatia and Serbia. They don't like each other, but they're both, Croatia's a NATO country. Serbia's not. So what does Croatia do to deal with the Serbs? It makes an alliance with Albania, also a NATO country, and Kosovo, not a NATO country. They make their own military alliance. Now, if NATO's this wonderful defensive alliance responsible for the defense of Europe, why do you have to create a defensive alliance within a defensive alliance? So what does Serbia do? They make a defensive alliance with Hungary, a NATO member, and Slovakia, a NATO member. Now you have within NATO 2 mini NATOs ready to fight each other. How healthy is that? And now let's talk about other things. Greece, we want you to give up some of your surface-to-air missiles to Ukraine. No, we ain't going to do that. Why? We're getting ready to go to war against Turkey. But isn't Turkey a NATO country? Yes, but we don't like them. Turkey, we want you to do this. No, we're not going to do that. Why? We got to be ready to go to war against Greece. But aren't they a NATO country? Yeah. Turkey resupplying its initiative in Libya. French naval ships try to interdict a Turkish civilian ship. Turkish Navy comes in, threatens the. So Turkey's ready to fight NATO. Aren't they NATO allies? Of course they are. NATO is a politically dysfunctional entity. It's disastrous how dysfunctional it is. And it's becoming even more so the longer it goes. This Ukrainian war is tearing it apart because it's creating pressures For instance, certain budgetary expectations of investment that can't be met. The European economy is devastated because of the blowback of the sanctions policies that they triggered with Ukraine. At a time when the economy is collapsing, societies are feeling the impact of this. Rutte and others are talking about tightening the belt. We're going to take your pensions. We're going to take this. We're going to take that so that we can what? Build the military to do what? Fight the Russians. Do we need to? So you have economic collapse, economic unsustainability, which leads to societal dysfunction. I mean, nobody talks about the underlying impact of what immigration policy has done to European societal integrity. You know, the whole concept of the EU was to sort of make borders go away. So that if you're in Portugal, you can go to England and get a job. No problem. The working population went to where the jobs were, and it was wonderful for Europe because you got to do all this moving around and leveled the playing field, and money came back to the southern parts. Sicily and southern Italy could suddenly be elevated to deal with the northern Italy, and you have equality in Portugal and Spain, and everything's wonderful, and it never worked. Because one of the problems is when you take away the borders, people come in. Immigration, massive waves of immigration. And it's just destabilized. France, there's parts of France that aren't French anymore, to be honest. There's parts of London, parts of England that aren't British anymore. That's how, and a lot of places are saying, we don't want that to happen here. And so now the EU, which has promulgated these policies on immigration, you're seeing deep societal fractures. A big part of the Polish elections dealt with immigration policy, Hungary immigration policy. It creates dysfunction. So this concept of European unity, economic unity, political unity, and military competence is a fantasy world. It's a fantasy world. So when Rutte speaks of this conflict in Ukraine making Europe stronger, first of all, it's fake. It's making Europe weaker. But of course, in this day and age of Orwellian doublespeak, Rutte can't tell the truth. He has to tell the lie. So you're making us militarily stronger because we're talking about spending 800 billion euro to build up the military. So we're becoming stronger. But why do you have to build up your military? Because you have no military capacity today. And can you afford that 800 billion? Nobody wants to talk about that. And even if you could, is there the capacity, the social will, the industrial capability to do what you say? No. But on paper, because they're talking about it, it makes them militarily stronger. And then the concept of Ukraine has unified us. We are closer together, unified in our approach towards making Russia the threat. But really, are they really that unified? I think the answer on that one is no. And societal, man, Europe is on the cusp of having just every government fall. Look what just happened in Poland. You know, the government of Donald Tusk is at risk now because Narwaki, Donald Trump's man, has come in. Look at, I think, Portugal. The far right party now is the third largest party in parliament, and the ruling government could very well collapse, and then that party could become real. Marine Le Pen in France, threatening Macron's viability. AfD in Germany, threatening Merz, even Starmer under attack. Europe is a seething mass of discontent. So from a societal standpoint, so Rutte is just spewing fiction. The reality is Europe is fundamentally broken, and this conflict is further, increasing these divides and these fractures. And eventually Europe's going to collapse in on the weight of its own incompetence.
Can we say that NATO has already know about sending troops to Ukraine because of the mercenaries that were involved in the war in Ukraine? They know that's not going to work for NATO. I'm not talking about, we know that NATO is not officially, but the French president said he's going to send French troops to Ukraine, British and maybe German troops to Ukraine. But when you look at the mercenaries and the way they were somehow helping the Ukrainian army, I would argue even they're in a higher position right now in Ukraine, because considering most of the Ukrainian important soldiers or commanders were killed by Russians during the conflict, during this war in Ukraine. If we assume that these mercenaries are running the show mostly, is that the case? And how is that going to help the West? I'm talking about European countries, the Western countries, France, United Kingdom, and Germany, to understand the concept of sending their troops to Ukraine.
First of all, I think we have to keep the whole mercenary question real. These, this isn't what was that famous movie, The Wild Geese? These ain't the wild geese. All right, there's some units that came in that attracted some personnel, but look at the backgrounds of the majority of the people that have been outed as mercenaries fighting. They're not combat veterans. They have no combat experience. Most of the time, they were people who were dishonorably discharged, or OTH, other than honorably discharged from the U.S. military or other militaries. These are people who are seeking validation of their own existence on this planet. So they opt to come to Ukraine and get that by engaging the Russians. And then they die. They get captured. These are pathetic people. They actually weaken the Ukrainians. They don't strengthen Ukrainians. Even, look, one of the more famous mercenaries out there is RFK Jr.'s son, who took a summer vacation to Ukraine. He had zero combat experience, zero military experience. So they had to train him up so what, he could run around and be a machine gun operator. How could you be a machine gun operator if you never operated a machine gun in your life? Okay, you get some rudimentary training, but I'm here to tell you right now, changing barrels under fire and doing it in a way that sustains the life of the barrel is something you don't learn, quickly, and you have to. This whole mercenary issue is just stupidity. Yes, there's been some. The Poles have brought in people that have been demobilized from the Polish military, come in. They fought in Bakhmut as units, and they were slaughtered. They invaded Kursk as units. You hear the Russians, civilians talking about, the Polish units. They're all dead. They all died. Tens of thousands have returned home in body bags. But the bottom line is the vast majority of the Western mercenaries are pathetic losers. These aren't hardened, wild geese kind of guys. I've got combat tours here, there, and everywhere. You got some people that have some combat experience, but even, they had a Marine retire. It was a gunnery sergeant, retired. He had some combat time a long time ago, but his last tour was a recruiting officer and recruiting NCO. And he retired and he went to Ukraine. He was dead, leading a deep reconnaissance group. That's what I love. I mean, my God, here's a guy like 47 years old, bad knees, bad back, and he's leaving a deep reconnaissance group into that. Now, deep reconnaissance group, this is a young man's game. First of all, you have to be trained in covert skills. And again, the fact that you went through something 12 years ago doesn't mean you maintain that skill set today. I always laugh because I go to Aikido, just because I'm going to fight you, but it actually teaches balance. When you get to my age with neuropathy, balance is very important. But I used to be a close combat instructor, but that was like 30 years ago. And so I'm in there, and in my mind, I'm like, God, do I even know what I'm doing anymore? Could I do these? And the bottom line is, if you don't train for it every day, you don't have that skill set. The fact that it's on your resume doesn't mean anything. Remember, I got back to training. And some of these skill sets, especially those necessary to do deep reconnaissance operations, are so, intense that you have to train all the time. So this guy came in, suddenly they made him a deep reconnaissance group because he used to be in the Marines, and he's dead. Because that's what happens, guys, when fat old men go off to play a young man's game. And when a young man goes off to play this game who has no training, he also dies. That's what happens to the majority of these mercenaries. They die. They die usually screaming, choking in their own blood, trying to push their guts back into their belly, but they die. That's the reality. Are there some units that have some tactical proficiency? Sure, they die. Look, they're chosen company. I forget what they call themselves. It's some unit attached to the Azov. They're going home. These are the guys that, they're the ultimate TikTok ex-warriors. Hey, we got our X page raising money and all this stuff so we can, fight Ukraine. But they don't fight Ukraine. They hang out in the rear with the prostitutes and the whores. They pay them for sex and they get drunk off of your money that you're donating, thinking you're helping these guys go off and fight the Russians. When they do go fight the Russians, they die. They're not that good. These mercenaries aren't good. They're pathetic, they're losers, and they die. Again, you'll find the exception. Hi, I served in 4 combat tours in Afghanistan. Good. Yay. What about your unit? Because the last time I checked, wars aren't won by individuals. They're won by a team that can fight together cohesively. Do you have that team that can fight together cohesively? And don't show me your X page where you guys pose against tanks destroyed by other people, because I know what you're doing. I know I can actually call a couple numbers right now and find out which brothel you're in tonight. And you know what? The Russians know what brothel you're in too. That's why they put missiles into them and kill you. Mercenaries don't tip the scales at all. They're pathetic. They're losers. They're nothing. They have no impact on this war whatsoever, other than to provide additional bodies to be ground up in the meat grinder. There's a huge difference between these mercenaries and what France and Britain are talking about deploying. You're talking about deploying cohesive military units that have trained together, have collective skill sets, and know how to operate as a team. That's what you're doing. And the British and the French have some of these units. One of the problems is sustainability. Logistics wins wars. So if I'm going to deploy a unit of 1,200 strong, I got to feed them. You ever thought about how we're talking about feeding 1,200 people? It's not feeding one person 3 meals a day, 1,200. So I got to have meals for one. I have to have 3,600 meals a day. Now you're talking about a week. Well, that adds a month. So it's a whole bunch. Now, how do you transport those meals? You need trucks. What makes trucks operate? Drivers and fuel. Where's fuel come from? Where do you store the fuel? Who brings the fuel to you? These are all logistic problems. Where do you house the guys when they get sick? Where's your medical facilities? Where's the power for that? The generators. Generators use fuel. More fuel needs to be brought in. Let's say they get involved in combat. You're giving them a basic load. But what does a basic load mean? It means different things in different ways. But it basically means for about 24 hours, you can engage in normal combat operations. But we're talking about high intensity conflict right now. So the unit gets engaged, it starts eating up ammunition. Where do you get your ammo from? You can't get it from the depot in England. You got to bring it forward. There's got to be a forward ammo depot. Now, have you learned how to break the ammo up into parcels that put it out in the front line, scatter it so that you don't have it all in one place so a missile comes in and blows everything up? But to scatter it out there, you need communications. Oh my God, we need radios. Radios need batteries. Batteries weigh a lot. Where do you get those? How do you store those? Where's your depot? Where's your forward depot? Where's your interim depots? Where's your advanced depots? All this. That's just logistics, sustaining 1,200 guys to fight. We haven't even talked about what happens when they get fight and they die or they get wounded, evacuated into wounded, the medical facilities, the care necessary, and then replacements. Because if I'm going to deploy a unit, 1,200, we'll call that a regiment-sized unit. That means that there are expectations that the unit performs the regimental capacity on the battlefield. But if it gets there and engaged, suffers 28 casualties the first day, it's no longer operating as a regiment now. So I either have to lower the expectations or I have to have the ability to reinforce or replace, which means I have to have another regiment ready to go in with all the logistics, sustainability issues of that. NATO can't do that anymore. The only army in the world that can do that, the only military in the world that can do that is the United States, because we train for it, but we don't even train for that much more anymore. But this is the reality. So that's why you hear the Europeans talk about, we can do this, but we need the American backstop. The American backstop is not just a military presence, but we do all the logistics. We do all the ships. We do all the port operations. We do all this stuff. That's what we do. Nobody else can do it. Only we do it, and we're not doing it anymore, which means NATO can't move. NATO can't fight. It's over before it even began.
Scott, when Vladimir Putin had a meeting with the Security Council in Russia, the way that he's talking about the West and how Russia is under the attacks from the West, here is what he said. And I think that could be definitely one of the reasons that these people who hate this sort of hatred, endless hatred toward the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Here is what he said.
Our cultural and civilizational space is currently facing strong competition. Different powers are vying to influence young minds. Traditional values are declared obsolete, and so-called neoliberal values are being promoted instead, while in the reality, they are totalitarian models. And they're not only introduced in Western countries, they're trying to export these models around the world, and trying to impose them on others. And it's clear why they're doing this. It's much easier to subjugate other nations, to turn them into vassals, if they stop being independent. So they're trying to introduce false values and attitudes that are destructive to the fabric of our society, trying to provoke interethnic and interfaith conflicts. However, we cannot isolate ourselves from the global information space. It is ineffective in today's world. We must consistently promote our own values, our cultural and humanitarian values and meanings. Russia's position is well known. We respect the unique identity of every nation, and we have many allies and like-minded nations.
He's drawing a very distinct line between what Russia sees and what he mentions about the West. How is that the case? Is that the main source of animosity toward Russia?
Anti-Russian animosity predates the digital age, meaning that we've been teaching Americans to hate Russians since 1917. Since the Bolshevik Revolution. Just watch it. I loved the movie when it came out in the 80s, and I watched it again just because I like the actor Warren Beatty. But Reds, movie about, 10 Days That Shook the World, the author that wrote it, who's buried in the Kremlin, by the way. Why I can't remember his name, probably because I'm 63 years old and my brain doesn't work like it used to. But it basically, if you look at that movie, you see the hatred that the United States had and the industrial America, capitalist America had towards the Bolsheviks, them damn Bolsheviks, them damn communists, them Russians. And it's sustained throughout the 20s and 30s as labor started to organize, as the American Communist Party started to become, more popular in the eyes of the workers. We equated the Russians with communists. We just said, those damn communists, them Ruskies, them this, that, and the other thing. That's the way it was. Then World War II came along and flipped the script for a little while, and suddenly they were our friends. But as soon as the war ended, reality came in. McCarthyism, the Red Scare, Sputnik, a little beeping ball made every American panic. Gagarin in space. Oh my God, the Russians. It's just the way it is. We've been fearing the Russians for a long time because it's used as a tool to control American society, to control labor policy, to control defense policy, defense spending, and all the mechanisms of societal control that comes with that. Dwight D. Eisenhower warned about it in 1961 farewell address. He spoke of the danger of the military-industrial complex, more importantly, the military-industrial congressional complex, the merging of money and political power with industrial, economic power creates this thing that's the enemy of democracy. And we've been doing that. We've been using Russia as the boogeyman since 1917. And we continue to do so today. But now what we're doing is we've gone on the offensive. We've been going on the offensive for some time now, trying to destroy societies from within. We almost succeeded. See, a lot of people think that Putin is speaking from a vacuum, historical vacuum. There's Putin just making shit up again. Excuse my language, making stuff up again. But he's not. See, because Russia went through the 1990s, The 1990s was a concerted effort by the United States and the Western European powers to destroy Russia, to eliminate Russia as a potential threat long term. And what you did is you made the Russians lose confidence in Russia and in being Russia, to lose Russian identity, and instead create this Western identity, this fake notion of what, ideal society should be, but it's all Western centric, so that every Russian was looking to the West, wanting to go to the West, immigrate to the West. Forget about Russia. It's dirty. It's corrupt. It's this, that, and the other thing. Leave. The West is wonderful. And for the Russians who couldn't afford, look to the West for guidance, for leadership, Western models of doing this, Western models of business, Western models of this, that, and the other thing. And it damn near came close to destroying Russia. Very, very close. Russia, 1998, 1999 was a basket case. A basket case. The Russia that Vladimir Putin inherited just was a nation on the cusp of collapse. What did he do in the next 25 years? He rebuilt it. Today, Russians are proud of being Russia because they have something to be proud of. They're proud of their economic achievements. They're proud of their social achievements. Russians are proud that they can walk their streets at night and not worry about crime, that the metros are clean, that there's food in the stores, that their standard of living is good. They can buy cars. They can have access to the internet. Russia can do everything we can do, and in some cases better. But the thing that united Russia and made Russians fall in love with Russia again was this unique Russian experience that's driven by faith, the Russian Orthodox Church, and societal norms. One of the things that the Russians emphasize is traditional family values. I will tell you this, the only person stronger than a Russian woman is a Georgian woman, and I married one of them. So I can tell you right now that, and I'm sure Iranian women are strong too. The point I'm trying to get at is societies that treasure the difference between a man and a woman produce strong women, very strong women, because they know what the hell a woman is. And therefore they are comfortable with the role that women plays in society. There is a role for females and there's a role for males. It's just the way biology works. It doesn't mean that women can't aspire to be doctors, lawyers, and Indian chiefs. Of course they can. And they can be damn good doctors. They can be great leaders of state. I'm not saying any of this limits them, but when you elect them, you're not electing something that's not a woman. You're saying that's a woman. Just like when you elect a man, you say that's a man. And Russia is predicated on a society that distinguishes between a man and a woman. When you see a Russian man, you're looking at a strong Russian man. When you see a Russian woman, you're looking at a strong Russian woman. Just like when you go to Georgia, there ain't no doubt what a Georgian man is, and there ain't no doubt what a Georgian woman is. And if a Georgian man ever crosses a Georgian woman, he'll wish he never did, because she ain't weak. But this defines who they are. The way you bring this down is to change that, is to remove distinctions, to attack traditional family values, to promote alternative lifestyles, to promote transgenderism. I mean, if you look at society, look at the history of societal development. I'm getting out of my lane here a little bit, but it is what it is. Patriarchal societies, yes, they're there. We all know the king is the king, but matriarchal societies are there. And in every patriarchal society, underneath it is a matriarchal system that runs it. The women run the household, the women do this, the women do that. The glue that holds society together is the woman, the mother. The mother holds the family together. We know this. We know it. The father is a gatherer, a hunter, goes out there and he does stupid crap. He goes, gets drunk in bars, comes home, pukes. The thing that holds the family together is the woman that picks him up, slaps him in the face, throws him in the shower, shakes him to wake up, feeds the kids, gets kids off to school, still has a job. The woman is the steel that holds the family together, and the woman is the steel that holds the society together. So when you stop calling a woman, when you allow a man to become a woman, that's the end of society. That's the end of it. If the glue is not there, society collapses. And that's the Western, that's especially when a society is built upon the distinction between a man and a woman. If you start attacking that distinction, that glue falls apart, that society collapses. And that's what we tried to do it in Georgia. Look at the entire approach of USAID and the National Endowment Democracy to Georgia, the Republic of Georgia. It was all about coming at the grassroots level and creating diversity. Because the first thing we say is we have to respect diversity. And the Georgians are going, no, we don't. No, we don't. He's a man. She's a woman. Man, woman. That's as diverse as we want to get. No, you got to respect diversity. You got to allow homosexuality. No, we don't. Yeah, you do. It's a European thing. You want to be part of Europe. And then transgenders, we got to do that. And then they build diverse groups. And then the next layer of the country, this is in their game plan, Nima. I'm not making it up. It's right in their game plan. Go look and research the investments and what we've been putting into diversification. And then we mobilize this diverse at the grassroots level to treat them into political process, to get them involved in governance at the grass level. We're still not at the top yet. Then you overlay that communications, how to communicate this. And then you overlay that. This is the important one. How to fight disinformation. But what they're talking about is once they do all this, the second society starts to scream, that's disinformation. You have to fight it. You have to attack it. Anything that goes against what you're saying now becomes disinformation. It must be attacked as such. And this is what they did in Georgia. They put it all in there and they almost succeeded because the NGOs then became a funding mechanism for this new diversified Georgian society. And it was only by changing the law to create the foreign agent laws to say we cannot allow this money to come in, that they starved off the NGOs, exposed what they were doing, and now Georgian society is moving towards normality. The preservation of the Republic of Georgia as a Georgian entity. Now, I'm not saying that works in America. I'm not saying you can take the Georgian way of life and plug it into America and it's going to work. It's not, because it's Georgian. It's Georgian. But we have to respect that. We have to respect what Georgia is, the reality of Georgia. The same as Russia. Russia is Russia. You're not going to take the Hollywood lifestyle and bring it to Russia. It's not going to work. The Russians are proud of who they are, but who they are is different from what we are. Not that they're not humans. We are humans. Russians tell jokes. Russians laugh. Russians cry. Russians love good food. Russians love good theater. Russians love sports. They love all this stuff, but they love it within the Russian context of faith and family values. In the United States, we de-emphasize faith, or when we bring it in, it's this artificial construct. But the Russians, we're talking about an Orthodox faith that is in their DNA. We don't have a state religion in the United States. So religion is whatever the hell the individual wants it to be or group, but it's different for everybody. In Russia, it is or it's the Islamic faith, which is amazing because Russia is supposed to be this Orthodox country, but has a significant Muslim population that gets along with the Russians. Why? Because they respect the Islamic faith. They're not trying to change it. The Russians didn't go into Chechnya and say, you have to stop being Chechens. They have peace with Chechnya because the Russians and the Chechens have learned to live together in peace and harmony, respectful of their differences and appreciative of, their separate identities cloaked in a singularity. We can't handle that in the West, so we're trying to destroy it. That's what we're trying to do when we go in and we take these societies apart. And the Russians are aware of this. Remember, Putin's been fighting this for 25 years. There's a reason why Putin in 2012 outlawed NGOs, because he saw what they were doing. Remember, it was the NGOs that funded Navalny. If the NGOs funded by the CIA are funding Navalny, funding supposed democratic opposition. The NGOs are the ones promoting homosexuality and transgenderism and all the things that tear apart traditional Russian values. And so he just unplugged it. And now he's talking about the need to promote Russian values, to make sure that as the West tries to use the new digital interaction, interconnectivity to flood Russia with Western ideas, that Russia can push back and say, no, these are Russian ideas. And the Russians today, it's a dangerous situation, actually, because in order to defeat the West, you have to promote sort of a hyper-nationalism in Russia. And that's always dangerous. I have no problem with people being proud. I'm proud to be an American. But, one of the dangers of hyper-American nationalism is American exceptionalism, where we say, well, Americans, we're better than everybody else. And that's a problem. And I do think the Russians have to find a balance. But the beauty of Russia is that the way it's constructed, the balance already exists. Because like I said, the ability of Russians and Chechens, it's a model that should be studied by everybody. And yet we deride it. The Chechens, it's just a bunch of corrupt Chechen warlords who pay their people off, and there's not really peace. And guys, I've been there. It's as genuine as it gets. And it's based upon respect for one another. The Russians already have built into their system tolerance for diversity, but it's diversity of ethnicity, diversity of religion, but it's not about diversity of some core values. One of the things that will ensure that Orthodox Russians and Chechen Muslims never separate is they both believe in traditional family values. They both know what a man is, they both know what a woman is, and they're both in agreement that needs to be preserved. So that's what Putin's pushing for. But he's a very smart man. He's been doing this for a very long time. And there's a reason why Russia is what it is today. That's because the Russians have learned to fall in love with being Russian and what it means to be a Russian again. And it's made for a wonderful country, a very diverse country, and a very strong country that we in the West still don't understand.
I think Russia is a very good example for all of us around the world. The way that they have Christians, Jews, Muslims all together, and they embrace what they have in common, and they respect what they have. It's some sort of differences that they have. The everyday life they
celebrate their differences. They celebrate their differences. When I was in Chechnya, I went to the Chechen National Theater and saw that, and Russians are appreciating this. They're not sitting there going, what's this? Russians are like, yeah, this is cool. Look at the Chechens. And they appreciate, and not only do they appreciate, they're knowledgeable of it. They can tell you what the dance is, the dance moves, and all this kind of stuff. It's amazing. It's just, I wish we had, it'd be like me going to a Native American celebration. Because right now what happens in America is we go around, we treat them as sort of a, an interesting diversion. Oh, look, the Native Americans, they're doing a Native American dance. They're wearing their Native American costumes. How quaint, how wonderful. Yay, I'm entertained. And then they leave. And for the Native American, that's got to be insulting as hell. But imagine if we came in and we sat down and we understood the significance of what they were doing. We understood every nuance in the clothing they wore. We understood the moves of the dance and the links to the history, and we appreciated it with a solemn deference to this, and we showed our respect, and we treated the Native Americans with the respect they deserve, and we embraced their diversity, and we encouraged their diversity. We weren't afraid when they sought to grow their diversity. We encouraged their growth because they were us and we were them. That's the Russians and the Chechens. That ain't America and its Native American population. We haven't learned how to do this kind of embrace of diversity, genuine diversity. I'm not talking about pride flags and rainbow flags and all this kind of stuff. I'm talking about real cultural diversity. We haven't gotten there yet, and yet we're one of the most culturally diverse nations in the world. What we try to do is erase the origin and create this notional collectiveness. But what is it? I always tell people, Russians, we can talk about the Russian soul. And I think one of the reasons why Russia's strong today is they've rediscovered the Russian soul and they've reabsorbed it. But there is no American soul. America doesn't exist based on some sort of spirituality of being an American. We exist because of concepts, ideals, values, freedom, independence, etc. That's why the Constitution is so important to be an American. But when we allow these values to be watered down, diluted, then we are adrift because we can't fall back on the American soul. What we can fall back upon is maybe being Italian American or being Irish American or being, Black American or being this or that. But then what you have is a society that's not unified, but actually broken up. And I think that's the direction we're heading right now, is we're looking at sort of dismemberment of America as this concept of the American dream, which many will say never really existed, to the American nightmare, which is a society that is breaking apart. And we see it every day. Los Angeles, we see it. I mean, we don't have to get in it, but 700 Marines being deployed. I'm a Marine. We don't belong in uniform on American soil. We shouldn't be carrying guns in front of American citizens. This is horribly disturbing to me. And yet that's where we're at. And unfortunately, I got to run because I have a.
Thank you so much, Scott. Great pleasure as always.
All right. Thanks a lot. Have a good
Bye-bye.
day. Yeah. Bye-bye.